These are 15 Appalachian mysteries with a real unanswered piece to them, and I am going to separate the record from the tale. The question is why the strongest ones stay open without anybody hiding an answer, and one case shows it plain. Get careless with these stories, and a family's fire becomes a false crime story. A bridge disaster gets blamed on a local legend instead of the failure that brought it down. And a person headed into mountain country may mistake search failure for something impossible, then ignore the ridge, weather, darkness, and distance from the road. Folks usually go wrong one of two ways. Every story proves the supernatural or old mountain people were foolish. Neither will do. A witness can be sincere, a story can belong to a place, and the record can still be incomplete. I have lived in Appalachia my whole life, and I was taught to tell a thing straight. We will start with the Sodder Fire, then Brown Mountain, Flatwoods, Point Pleasant, the Bell Witch, and mountain disappearances. Each gets the record, the open question, and the folklore. And old clippings, photographs, and oral history quotes get their source and date, so later retelling does not pass for record. That is the rule. First, ask what was recorded at the time. Second, ask the one question nobody has answered. Third, name the part that lives mainly as a story people kept telling. That rule matters because thin sourcing can turn a family loss or a local disaster into a confident false story. A newspaper-style graphic, a grave voice, and a tale repeated often enough do not make proof. Old rural cases can stay open for plain reasons. Records were sparse, searches were limited, and steep country can hide evidence. No hidden culprit is required. If an old clipping or photograph comes on screen, look for the outlet or collection and the date printed with it. A record made near the event carries a different weight from somebody's retelling years later. My mama, my pop, and my grandmama handed things down straight. If they knew a thing, they said so. If it was a story, they said that too. Folklore deserves respect, but it does not become evidence because it is told with confidence. So these 15 are not 15 equal case files. We have 5 questions in the Sodder, Brown Mountain, and Flatwood stories, 2 around Point Pleasant, 2 in the Bell Witch record, and 4 about disappearances, unidentified remains, and what later identification can answer. We begin in Fayetteville, West Virginia, with a documented Christmas Eve fire and 5 children never conclusively accounted for. The documented record is this. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder home in Fayetteville caught fire. 5 Sodder children were never conclusively accounted for. That is the first question. What happened to those 5 children? The second is what later reports and the family's beliefs can tell us. They matter because they show why the case did not settle in the minds of the people living with it, but they did not produce a universally accepted answer. The record does not establish whether the children died in that fire or survived and left. And before anybody carries this into a darker tale, remember what careless guessing does. Graphic talk, named villains, and a confident made-up crime can damage a family's name and spread false certainty long after the facts have gone thin. Do not call it kidnapping, murder, arson, concealment, or a cover-up unless the record proves it. Here, it does not. If this case is too upsetting, skip it. That is fair. It is a family fire and missing children, and it ought not be used like a campfire performance. There are stories you do not improve by making them uglier. You tell what the record holds and leave the rest where it belongs, unanswered. Brown Mountain asks a different kind of question. No family's fate is at its center. It is about lights seen across dark mountain distance and what an observer may actually be looking at. The Brown Mountain lights have been reported for generations in western North Carolina. That much belongs in the record. And an official inquiry in 1922 attributed the lights it examined to distant train lights, not to anything supernatural. That leaves 3 honest questions. Why did people keep reporting lights after that? What source did any one observer see on any one night? And why have later accounts still left competing explanations instead of one answer everybody accepts? Before you decide a witness was foolish or lying, remember what darkness does to distance. A light across a ridge can look close when it is far off. Distant headlights, train lights, and atmospheric refraction can shift where a light seems to sit or move. A person may tell you plain what they saw and still not know what caused it. A light across a dark ridge is like a voice in a hollow. You may hear it plain, but you had best not swear you know exactly where it started. And if you do not want ghost stories, fair enough. Treat Brown Mountain as cultural and environmental history. When an old clipping or photograph comes up, look for its source and date. A 1922 inquiry is one kind of record. A later retelling is another. So keep the report separate from the cause. The lights are not established as supernatural, and no single explanation is accepted across the reports. That same care matters even more at Flatwoods, West Virginia, where several people reported a bright object and a towering figure close enough to become a lasting legend. On September 12, 1952, several boys and adults in Flatwoods reported seeing a bright object fall or move nearby. After that, they reported a strange object and a towering figure. That is the documented starting point, a real report from a real place with more than one witness. Now, multiple witnesses do not turn a report into a laboratory result. The open question is what, if anything, they had seen. The original accounts do not establish a verified ordinary object. They also do not prove an alien, a demon, or a creature, and that is where the tale grew legs. Later, retellings gave the figure a fixed name and a fixed shape, until folks began speaking of it as a confirmed monster. A story can matter to a place without becoming a fact of nature. That does not take anything from it. It keeps its name honest. If you see a newspaper account from the time, identify it as a newspaper account and use its date where it is available. If you see later artwork or a later retelling, call it later. Do not stack them together and call the pile proof. If this sounds too legendary for you, stay with the date, the place, the witness reports, and the unanswered identification. Skip the later creature claims. The plain description is enough. Witnesses reported an unusual object and figure, and the record does not establish what either was. That same sort of report traveled downriver to Point Pleasant, where strange figures became tied in public memory to a real bridge disaster. Around Point Pleasant in the late 1960s, people reported what came to be called Mothman. Those reports came before the Silver Bridge collapsed on December 15, 1967. That order of events is why they became joined in folks' minds. It does not prove one caused the other or warned of the other. Keep the disaster record separate before you talk about a warning or a prediction. The bridge collapse was a documented structural failure and disaster. A hard thing happened there. No tale, however memorable, ought to make the real failure harder to see. Now, the Mothman record is folklore-rich. We cannot cleanly pull every original bit of testimony apart from what later retellings added on, but the record does hold two separate things. People made reports around Point Pleasant, and the Silver Bridge had its own documented cause. Joining them makes a story. It does not establish a cause. And no, you cannot say somebody did it. Do not name a suspect or claim a crime without proof in the record. Witness reports, a structural failure, and a local legend do not make an accusation. That is the harm in tying folklore to a disaster too tight. It can turn real loss into spectacle and hide what actually failed. The Bell Witch asks a different question altogether. No modern disaster record there, only early Tennessee folklore and later retellings layered over it. The Bell Witch story is rooted in early 19th century Tennessee folklore around the Bell family. That much we can say. Surviving accounts tell of alleged haunting experiences, and later versions carry the tale onward. What they do not give us is proof, by a modern standard, that a witch existed. So there are two separate questions. What did people say was happening around the Bell family? And which details came later, growing with each retelling? On the second question, I do not know, and neither does the record cleanly. The Bell Witch and Mothman both have this trouble. Original testimony and later embellishment cannot be neatly pulled apart in every version. The old people knew a story had uses besides proving a fact. It could warn, entertain, remember a place, and bind folks together. That does not make it a court record, and it does not make old mountain people ignorant either. Knowing what kind of story you are carrying is part of good sense. If you do not want ghost stories, take this as folklore history. The evidence worth keeping is that the story endured and changed, not that a haunting was proven. When you hear an oral history quote or see an archival version, ask who preserved it, when was it recorded, and is it testimony, folklore, or later entertainment. Label modern retellings modern. That question matters even more when a story concerns somebody who vanished in steep country. There, an unanswered record can grow into legend for a harder reason. The mountains can keep a search from finding its answer at all. A missing person in mountain country is not proof of a hidden hand, a hidden network, or anything beyond the ground itself. Before we turn an absence into a tale, remember what defeats a search: steep slopes, weather closing in, darkness, distance from a road, and ground that can scatter what little evidence there was. That is search failure. It is not mystery alone. An early search can miss the right hollow or ridge because the area is too large and the conditions cut down where people can safely look. A later recovery may not happen because time, weather, decomposition, and scatter have changed the ground. Older cases carried another burden: thinner records and less technology than we have now. So, no recovery does not identify a cause. If you only want the practical part, this is it. Before a mountain outing, note your route, the trailhead or road access, the daylight left, and the weather. A ridge can look close until you have to walk it. I have traveled around this country and always wanted home, but home country still requires sense. And when you read an old disappearance, call it unresolved unless the record gives more. Do not fill the empty place with a favorite theory. Still, sometimes remains are found years later and compared against a missing person record. That can answer who the person was. It does not always answer what happened, and that distinction is the final question we need to carry uphill. When skeletal remains are later connected to a missing person through forensic comparison that can give a family a name where there had only been an unknown. That matters. Do not sneer at a partial answer because it is not the whole answer. In a cold case, those are two different things. But identification answers one question: who was found? It may not answer where the person went missing, why they disappeared, what happened between, or what caused the death. Old records may be thin. The original search may have been limited by weather, rough ground, darkness, and distance from roads. Evidence can be lost long before a later recovery, and a false ending does harm when a headline makes an identification sound like a full explanation. It sends people hunting for a culprit, a hidden plot, or some mountain thing that the record does not establish. If this sounds too legendary for you, this is the least legendary part of the whole subject. Read a cold case update for the exact answer it gives: identity, recovery, cause, or none of those beyond what is stated. A name recovered from uncertainty is no small thing, but an unanswered cause stays unanswered. And that brings us to the rule beneath all 15 stories. Incomplete records leave rough edges, and rough edges are where people start mistaking a gap for proof. That gap does not prove somebody hid an answer. It does not prove a monster either. It proves the record ran out before the question did. The Sodder children were never conclusively accounted for, and there is no universally accepted resolution. Brown Mountain lights have competing explanations, including distant human-made lights and atmospheric effects with no single answer accepted across the record. Flatwoods rests heavily on what witnesses reported. Mothman belongs to witness reports and later folklore, while the Silver Bridge collapse has its own documented structural failure. The Bell Witch carries early Tennessee folklore and later additions tangled together. And in the mountains, weather, darkness, steep ground, distance from roads, decomposition, and scatter can leave a search with no recovery at all. So use 4 questions. What was documented at the time? What exact question remains open? What later version added certainty? And what does the record not permit you to claim? Many Appalachian mysteries repeated on YouTube have thinner sourcing than the narration lets on. That is how a family loss gets turned into a false crime story, or a real disaster gets covered over with a tale. I do not think the old ways were ignorance. My people taught me that knowing when to say, "I do not know," is part of telling a thing straight. Keep the record, keep the open question, keep the folklore, do not mix them up. If you want another piece of Appalachian knowledge folks brush off as old-fashioned, come with me to the kitchen. Why did Grandma's food taste better when she had no fancy tricks at all? I will show you 7 Appalachian methods, what each one does to the flavor, texture, and keeping quality of everyday food, and which habits were tested sense instead of nostalgia. Keep a good question where you can reach it.